Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're enjoying these untold Hollywood secrets, please hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking celebrity revelations. Your support means the world to us. Now let's get into this amazing story. It was October 8th, 1971, and the Beverly Hills Hotel ballroom was filled with 180 of Hollywood's most powerful people for the annual Directors Guild Awards dinner. At table 7 sat Dean Martin, nursing his fourth scotch of the evening and holding court with a group of Rat Pack associates and studio executives. At table 12, across the room, sat Clint Eastwood with his agent and a few close friends, quietly celebrating his recent success with Dirty Harry. Dean had been drinking since the cocktail hour, and his usual charming wit was beginning to turn cruel and sarcastic. That's when someone at Dean's table mentioned that Clint Eastwood was being considered for the lead in a major studio musical. What Dean said next, in a voice loud enough for half the ballroom to hear, would create one of the most legendary confrontations in Hollywood history, and Clint's response would teach Dean Martin a lesson about dignity that he would never forget. Now, let me back up here and explain the tension that had been building between these two very different stars, because their confrontation was years in the making. By 1971, Dean Martin was 54 years old, and at the height of his fame as a member of the Rat Pack, he was known for his smooth voice, his effortless charm, and his ability to make everything look easy. Dean represented old-school Hollywood glamour, the kind of entertainer who could sing, act, and crack jokes with equal skill. Clint Eastwood, on the other hand, was 41 and represented a completely new kind of movie star. He was quiet, intense, and specialized in playing characters who spoke more with their actions than their words. Dean and Clint represented two completely different philosophies about entertainment, recalled director Don Siegel, who worked with both men. Dean believed in making it look effortless. Clint believed in making it feel real. The two men had worked in Hollywood for years without having any significant interaction, but Dean had been making increasingly critical comments about the new generation of actors who were challenging the traditional studio system. Dean felt threatened by actors like Clint, explained entertainment journalist Army Archard. These guys were making movies that were grittier, more violent, and more psychologically complex than anything the Rat Pack generation had ever done. Dean was particularly dismissive of Clint's spaghetti westerns and his breakout role as Harry Callahan in Dirty Harry. Real movie stars don't need to whisper their lines or hide behind sunglasses, Dean had told a reporter just weeks before the Directors Guild dinner. They command the screen with their presence, not their props. It was clear that Dean viewed Clint as part of a new wave of actors who were destroying the elegance and sophistication that had made Hollywood great. Actually, let me tell you about what was really bothering Dean about Clint's success, because it went deeper than just professional differences. Dean Martin had built his career on being effortlessly cool. He made singing, acting, and entertaining look so easy that audiences believed he was just naturally gifted without having to work at it. But Clint's approach to acting was completely different. He was methodical, serious, and intensely focused on his craft. Clint represented everything Dean wasn't, observed director Blake Edwards. Where Dean was loose and spontaneous, Clint was controlled and precise. Where Dean relied on natural charisma, Clint relied on careful preparation. The success of Dirty Harry had particularly rankled Dean because it represented a type of character that the Rat Pack generation couldn't or wouldn't play. Harry Callahan was morally ambiguous, psychologically complex, and willing to operate outside the rules. He wasn't charming or likable in the traditional sense. He was effective. Dean's characters were always fundamentally decent guys who you'd want to have a drink with, noted film critic Pauline Kael. Clint's characters were often dark, obsessive, and potentially dangerous. They reflected a different kind of masculinity. The Directors Guild dinner was supposed to be a celebration of the year's best films and filmmakers, but Dean had arrived already in a confrontational mood. He had been passed over for several major roles that year, and younger actors like Clint were getting the parts that would have automatically gone to Rat Pack members just a few years earlier. Don't forget to comment below and let us know what other Hollywood confrontations you'd like to hear about. The incident began when producer Robert Evans mentioned that Clint was being considered for the lead in Man of La Mancha, a big-budget musical adaptation of the Broadway hit, Clint Eastwood in a Musical. Dean said loudly, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "That's like asking a mule to dance ballet." The conversation at nearby tables stopped as people turned to see what Dean was talking about. "I mean, really," Dean continued, warming to his theme. "The guy mumbles his way through movies where he shoots people and squints a lot. Now they want him to sing and dance?" Several people at Dean's table laughed nervously, but others looked uncomfortable with the direction this was heading. Dean warned his longtime friend Joey Bishop, "Maybe you should keep it down." But Dean was just getting started. "You know what Clint Eastwood is," Dean said, his voice getting even louder. "He's a hack, a pretty face who got lucky with a few violent movies and now thinks he's a serious actor." The entire ballroom had gone quiet now. Everyone was watching Dean, waiting to see how far he would take this public humiliation of one of Hollywood's rising stars. "The guy has one expression," Dean continued, "squint and shoot. That's it. That's his entire range as an actor." At table 12, Clint sat perfectly still, his face showing no emotion as Dean's words carried clearly across the room. "And now they want to put him in a musical. What's next? Jerry Lewis in a serious drama about Vietnam." Dean's table erupted in laughter, but the rest of the ballroom remained silent, watching this ugly display of professional jealousy. That's when Clint Eastwood stood up. He didn't rush toward Dean's table, he didn't raise his voice, he simply stood up, adjusted his jacket, and began walking slowly across the ballroom toward where Dean was sitting. Every eye in the room followed him as he made his way between the tables, his face calm and his movements deliberate. Dean, realizing that Clint was approaching, fell silent for the first time all evening. When Clint reached Dean's table, he stopped directly behind Dean's chair and placed one hand gently on Dean's shoulder. "Excuse me, Dean," Clint said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the silent ballroom. "I think you dropped something." Dean looked confused. "I dropped something?" "Yeah," Clint said, his voice still calm and polite. "Your class." The line hit like a thunderbolt. The entire ballroom gasped, and Dean's face went white. But Clint wasn't finished. "You know, Dean," Clint continued, his voice still conversational, "I've always admired your work. You're a talented entertainer, and you've brought joy to millions of people." Dean looked up at Clint, unsure where this was going. "But tonight, in front of all these people who respect and admire you, you've chosen to tear down a fellow actor instead of building up the industry we all love." Clint's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath the politeness. "I don't know what I did to earn your disrespect, but I'm sorry if my success has somehow diminished yours. Because from where I sit, there's room in Hollywood for all kinds of entertainers." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. "You called me a hack, Dean. Maybe I am, but at least I'm a hack who treats his colleagues with dignity." Clint paused, letting that sink in. "You want to criticize my acting? That's your right. You want to say I don't belong in musicals? You might be right about that too, but doing it here in front of these people in this way, that doesn't make you clever or funny or superior. It makes you small." Dean's face was now bright red, but he seemed unable to speak. "Actually, let me tell you what happened next, because this is where Clint showed everyone what true class looks like." Instead of walking away after delivering this devastating response, Clint pulled up an empty chair from a nearby table. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked Dean. Dean, still speechless, just nodded. Clint sat down and leaned forward, lowering his voice so that only Dean and the people at his immediate table could hear. "Dean," Clint said quietly, "I don't know you personally, but I know your reputation. People say you're a good man who's been generous with young performers, who's helped a lot of people in this business. That's the Dean Martin I respect, not this one." Dean finally found his voice. "Look, Clint, I was joking around. Were you?" Clint asked. "Because it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like you were trying to hurt me to make yourself feel better." Dean looked down at his drink, unable to meet Clint's eyes. "What's really bothering you, Dean? Because this isn't about me or my acting or whether I belong in musicals." For a moment, Dean just sat there. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to speak. "You want to know what's bothering me," Dean said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm 54 years old, and Hollywood is changing. The kind of movies I make, the kind of character I play, they don't want that anymore. They want guys like you, dark, complicated, intense, not guys like me who just want to make people smile." Clint listened without interrupting. "And I guess," Dean continued, "I guess I took that out on you because you represent everything I'm not, and everything I can't be." The honesty in Dean's voice was heartbreaking. Here was one of the biggest stars in the world, admitting that he felt obsolete. "Dean," Clint said softly, "you're wrong about something. Hollywood will always need entertainers like you. Not everyone wants to watch dark, violent movies. Sometimes people just want to be charmed and entertained by someone who makes it look effortless." "But that's just it," Dean replied. "It's not effortless anymore. I have to work harder now to get roles, to stay relevant. And seeing someone like you succeed so easily," Clint interrupted, and for the first time there was a hint of emotion in his voice. "Dean, do you know how long I struggled before anyone took me seriously? How many rejections I got? How many people told me I'd never be more than a TV cowboy? Success isn't easy for anyone. It just looks that way from the outside." Dean looked up at Clint, really seeing him for the first time that evening. "I owe you an apology," Dean said. "What I said was wrong. It was cruel, and it was unworthy of both of us." Clint extended his hand. "Apology accepted." As they shook hands, the entire ballroom burst into applause, but Clint held up his other hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, standing up and addressing the room, "I'd like to say something about Dean Martin." The ballroom went quiet again. "This man has entertained millions of people for over 20 years. He's brought joy, laughter, and music to families all over the world. He's been generous with his time, his talent, and his money in helping others." Clint's voice grew stronger. "One moment of poor judgment doesn't erase a lifetime of excellence. Dean Martin deserves our respect and our gratitude, not our criticism. So I'd like to propose a toast," Clint said, picking up a glass from the table, "to Dean Martin, a true entertainer and a class act." The entire ballroom rose to their feet, raising their glasses and toasting Dean Martin. Dean himself was openly crying now, overwhelmed by Clint's generosity in the face of his cruelty. When the toast was finished and people began to sit down, Dean grabbed Clint's arm. "Why?" Dean asked. "Why did you do that, after what I said to you?" Clint's answer was simple. "Because that's what you would have done for me if our positions had been reversed." "How do you know that?" "Because despite what happened tonight, I believe you're a good man who made a mistake, and good men deserve second chances." The aftermath of that evening was immediate and profound. The story of Clint's gracious response to Dean's attack spread through Hollywood within days, enhancing Clint's reputation as a man of character and integrity. But more importantly, it began a genuine friendship between two very different men. After that night, Dean and Clint became close friends, recalled Joey Bishop. Dean would call Clint for advice about roles, about life, about staying relevant in a changing business. Dean also became one of Clint's biggest supporters in Hollywood, publicly praising his work and defending him against critics. "Clint Eastwood taught me something that night," Dean said in a later interview. "He taught me that real strength isn't about tearing other people down. It's about building them up, even when they don't deserve it." The incident at the Directors Guild dinner became legendary in Hollywood as an example of how to handle conflict with grace and dignity. Clint could have destroyed Dean that night, observed director Robert Altman. He had every right to humiliate him in return, but instead, he chose to elevate him. That's the mark of a truly great man. When Dean Martin died in 1995, Clint was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. In his eulogy, Clint spoke about the night they first really met. Dean taught me that everyone deserves forgiveness, that everyone deserves a second chance, and that the measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes, but how he handles them when they're pointed out to him. Dean Martin was a great entertainer, but more than that, he was a man who could admit when he was wrong and change for the better. That's rarer than talent, and more valuable than fame. The day Dean Martin called Clint Eastwood a hack was supposed to be the day Dean proved his superiority over the new generation of actors. Instead, it became the day Clint Eastwood showed Hollywood what real class looks like. Not the kind that comes from expensive clothes or exclusive clubs, but the kind that comes from treating others with dignity, even when they don't treat you the same way. Dean Martin thought he could put Clint Eastwood on his knees with insults and cruelty, but Clint's response put Dean on his knees in a completely different way, on his knees with gratitude for being shown mercy when he deserved judgment. That's the difference between power and strength. Power tears people down, strength builds them up. Clint Eastwood chose strength, and in doing so he gained not just respect, but a friend. The kind of friend who would defend you for the rest of his life, because you showed him kindness when he showed you cruelty. That's what happened the night 180 people watched Clint Eastwood turn an enemy into an ally, with nothing more than grace, dignity, and the wisdom to know that winning isn't about defeating your opponent, it's about helping them become better than they were. Dean Martin learned that lesson the hard way. But thanks to Clint Eastwood's generosity, he got the chance to learn it at all.